Hello and welcome everyone to ITProGuide. Mohammed Niaz with you. In this video, I'm going to talk to you about how to set up SAML authentication in Azure AD for third-party application. So a SAML is a security assertion markup language. It's an open standard. So with SAML, you can pass authorization from an identity provider to a service provider. So in this demo, Azure AD is the identity provider and DropBox is going to be the service provider. You can use SAML for third-party applications like Adobe or SAP or your own application also. But in this demo, to have an understanding, I will show you with a DropBox. So the users who have a DropBox can access their DropBox account using an Azure AD username and password, and thereby we can achieve single sign-on for third-party application with Azure AD and SAML authentication. If you look at the personal accounts we have like Gmail, Facebook, then YouTube, Amazon Prime, a lot of accounts we use in our day-to-day life, and we keep separate username and password for all these accounts. For YouTube and Gmail, you don't need a separate username and password because you can use the same username and password as it come from the same vendor. But at the same time, you cannot use Gmail account to log into Facebook. So we have to use separate username and password. And you may saw that some application, they provide a way to log in using Facebook account or Gmail account to access their application. So their Gmail or Facebook, they provide the authorization because they have identity providers. So they provide authorizations to this third-party application, and by this way you are able to access to this application using the Google account ID or Facebook account ID. In an enterprise environment, you have a bunch of applications like SAP, Oracle, and many other applications that you use to operate your business. So using separate username and password in an enterprise environment is going to be very difficult because your users have to remember different username and password to access all these applications. And also as an administrator, you have to manage all these applications from separate portal. And think about a situation where your user resigned from the organization. You have to go to each application and disable it. But at the same time, if you have a single identity to manage all these application access, then at one point you can disable and that stop access to all this application from the user. So we are going to see how to integrate the authentication, how to authorize your third-party application from Azure AD using SAML. SAML is not the only protocol that you can do. There are other protocols which works better than SAML. So we will see that also in the coming videos. In this video, we will focus on SAML, how to use Azure AD SAML authentication method to authenticate or to pass authorization to third-party applications. Some of you may have a confusion about SAML protocol or SAML authentication, because when I say single sign-on, we use password hash synchronization, pass-through authentication to achieve single sign-on. Then why we need SAML or some other protocol to achieve a single sign-on? So put this way, you have Active Directory in your environment and you have some application that runs on premises, and this application use Active Directory to authenticate the user and provide access, which means you have single sign-on in your on-premises environment because all the applications are authorized from the Active Directory. So users have single username and password to authorize your application. The moment you start services like Office 365, Exchange Online, SharePoint Online, Microsoft Teams, then the local on-premises Active Directory is now more capable to handle your authentication or authorization. In this case, you need Azure AD. So you have two directories, Azure AD and on-premises Active Directory. As both come from the same vendor, that is Microsoft, Microsoft provides some tools like Azure AD Connect. So you have different way to synchronize your users information, and by this way you can manage the authentication from single platform, that is password hash synchronization, pass-through authentication, and federation. We already discussed this and we did a good demo on all these methods. So now the moment you have a third-party application like DropBox or Adobe Create or SAP or Oracle, they are different product. You don't have a Microsoft own solution to do that. So you have to use a standard authentication method for this. So there it comes the importance of SAML. So we can use SAML authentication protocol to authorize your third-party application from Azure AD. So once you have a third-party application, then Azure AD Connect is no more enough to have a single sign-on in your organization. Then you have to think about something else. As these vendors are different, you need to use something standard. There comes the importance of SAML. So let's begin to understand SAML. SAML is a protocol for authentication. In your organization, you have one identity provider where the user's username and passwords are stored. And most probably it is Active Directory. So Active Directory use NTLM or Kerberos protocol to authenticate applications, or Windows desktops get users authenticated from Active Directory. Now, what if I need a third-party application like, for example, a leave management application to be installed in the organization and to get the new application authenticated from Active Directory? It should support NTLM or Kerberos authentication method, because these are the two protocols that Active Directory is known. But the new modern cloud applications are not using Kerberos or NTLM authentication, because they are not just made for Microsoft only environment. So they use standard protocols like SAML or OAuth or OpenID to authenticate from an identity provider to get a single sign-on for their customers. So we have two options here in a Microsoft environment. Install Active Directory Federation service with Active Directory in your environment, so that you can use a protocol like SAML to authenticate users from Active Directory. As SAML is a standard protocol, most of the cloud applications support this protocol, so you don't need to create a separate username and password for the new cloud applications that you have. The second option is, if you already have a hybrid identity setup or Azure AD in your environment, then you can configure Azure AD as the identity provider for SAML authentication, so that your third-party applications now can authenticate from Azure AD. And this video is only to cover the second one, that is SAML in Azure AD. So let's get familiar with the terminologies in SAML. IDP is the identity provider. In our case, it is Azure AD. Then SP is the service provider, that is DropBox. The first step in a SAML configuration is federation trust between the parties involved in a SAML authentication. So we have IDP, that is Azure, and we have SP, that is DropBox. So both these parties have to provide an SML file, which is known as metadata. So a metadata from the identity provider is uploaded to the service provider and vice versa. So this file is provided is to understand the configuration information and to create a baseline trust. Before we go deep into the topic, I would like to show you the user experience that you are going to get once you have SAML authentication in your organization. You can see that the Dropbox here, this is the service provider in this demo. So to sign into the Dropbox, I just need to enter my email address of user. So once I enter the email address of the user, I click sign in. So Dropbox identified that this email address belongs to Azure AD, or Azure AD is the identity provider for this user. So it navigate or it redirect you to the Azure AD login page, where you have to enter your credentials and complete the sign-in process. Once you complete the sign-in process and you get a successful authentication, then you are automatically redirect back to the Dropbox and you get access to your cloud service. So this is the experience that a user get once you have a single sign-on with SAML authentication. So now you saw the user experience and the single sign flow with SAML and Azure AD. So let me try to explain it with this flow diagram. So the first step is user try to access the application, that is Dropbox here, and the application find that the identity provider is Azure AD. So the application generate a SAML 2.0 authentication request and redirect the user browser to Azure AD sign-on URL. So you saw this step that the moment you enter your email address and Dropbox found that this is from Azure AD, it redirect automatically to Azure AD login page. But what you didn't see is the authentication request, and that is what I'm going to show you now. So what you see now is the authentication request sent by DropBox to Azure AD to get the user authenticated. And the authentication request includes the service URL and the identity number, then what kind of format that the response need to be included for the username ID and all. So let's have a detailed look of this. In the authentication request details sent by a service provider to an identity provider, the XML includes ID, where Azure ID use this ID when it responds back to the service provider to fill the value in response to attribute. Then the version number is there, that is SAML 2.0. Then date and time is given in the issue instant. Then the assertion consumer service URL is the redirect URL. So after authentication, the identity provider, that is Azure AD, send response to this URL via a user browser. So after authentication, the identity provider, that is Azure AD, send response back to this URL via user browser. Then the issuer name is Dropbox. It must exactly match with the service principal names in the cloud service in Azure AD. So when we create this configuration, we have to provide same name in the Azure AD. So this must match, otherwise the SAML authentication will not work. Then there is name ID policy. We mentioned name ID as email address. You can see that in the format we specified email address. So based upon this format, Azure AD will return the identity provider information. So now in the request we asked that the format is email address. So when the user get authenticated, then Azure AD responds with the email address. So this is how the Dropbox identify the user response. So from the Azure AD login page, once the user complete the sign in and got successfully signed in, then Azure AD send a response to the service provider, that is Dropbox here, via the user browser. You can see the post request here to dropbox.com/SAML login. This is the response that from Azure AD to Dropbox. So response is a bit lengthy file where you can see more information here. So I will explain to you the important field in this SAML response. So you can see here the destination which includes the dropbox.com/SAML login. So this is the URL where the user browser gonna redirect after complete the authentication. And the ID value that filled this in response to attribute is provided in the authentication request. If you look at the authentication request, you can see that Dropbox provided a ID as a part of authentication request, and that is added to the in response field here. Then in the issuer, you can see the URL is created with the Azure AD subscription ID. Then we have a status element which which include the information about the authentication status. So here it is success. If it is a failure, you will find it unsuccessful or something else here. Then we have a signature element, which means a digital signature is included. So this will help the Dropbox that the user is get authenticated from the right source, as it contains a signature that the cloud service provider, that is Dropbox, can verify that the authentication is from the right source. You can see the signature value and the certificate here. Then come down where you can see the condition here. So the validity of this authentication, you can see so once this time expired, then the user have to re-authenticate. Then the audience include the name or the service principal name, that is Dropbox. If you go back to the authentication request, we provided that the issuer name here Dropbox. So that is what is provided here in the audience field. Then finally the attribute statement, which contain the information or the claims for Dropbox. So you can see that the tenant ID here, then object identifier here, then the display name of the user, that is Sumi. Then we have the identity provider that includes the subscription ID. Then what kind of authentication method has performed, it was a password authentication. then the given name, then email address, name. So these are the claims provided by identity provider, that is Azure AD, to Dropbox. You can control this, but these are the minimum informations that at least a service provider needed. Then you have the authentication instant. Then authentication context is used to specify the context that used to authenticate the user. So this is how a response XML file filled up. So once the service provider, that is Dropbox here in this example, receive the SAML response, then the service provider will verify, as it contains a signature signed from Azure AD. Then it would be easy for Dropbox to verify the authenticity of this SAML response. So once it completes the verification, and if that is a successful authentication, then Dropbox will provide access to the user. So we saw that after a successful sign-in, when I show you the user experience after a successful sign-in, then user get access to the Dropbox. So during this authentication flow, you can see that the IDP, that is the identity provider, and the service provider are not directly talking. The authentication request sent by a service provider to an IDP, that is identity provider, is through the user browser, and also the response that sent by an identity provider to the service provider is also through user browser. So there is no direct communication between an IDP and a service provider in a SAML authentication. So before all this, the first step that comes in a SAML authentication is the metadata. So as I told you that both the parties involved in this SAML authentication have to share a metadata. This metadata contains the informations about the configurations that both parties can accept, and that create a baseline trust, as I told you in the beginning of the slides. So this is how a metadata looks. It's begin with the entity descriptor, which include entity ID, then ID value, then validity and cache duration. So if you look at the XML file that's shared by Microsoft to, that is means Azure AD to Dropbox, or you can see that the entity descriptor include the ID value, then entity ID, and it didn't mention anything related to the cache duration or validity, because that attributes are optional. Then the signature can be used to sign various elements in a metadata definition. Then we have a role descriptor, which define the capabilities of SAML entity. Then what are the type of claims that the Azure AD can offer to a service provider, so which includes like the display name, then can provide, for example, email address, and then tenant ID, object identifier, like this. So from these XML metadata file, the service provider can understand what are the configurations that accepted by Azure AD. And you can see that in the key descriptor it is mentioned very clear that it is signing. So the other option here is encryption, but here the value is signing, which means this is signed. Service provider can verify using the certificate provided by Azure AD. If it is encrypted, which means the service provider have to decrypt it. There is a difference. And the final one in the binding, you can see that this is a HTTP post, which means that the identity provider send the assertion, that is the SAML response, back through the user agent directly to the service provider. The other value that you can find here is HTTP artifact, which means the identity provider sends a unique number, which is a reference to the service provider through the user agent. So once the service provider get this token or this unique reference number, then the service provider contact directly with the identity provider to retrieve the SAML assertion. So HTTP post is what you used in this demo, but if you have HTTP artifact, then the IDP and service provider communicate directly instead of forwarding the SAML assertion through user agent. So we're done with the slides. Now it's time to start our demo. So what I'm going to show you is I'm going to configure Azure AD and Dropbox for SAML authentication, and I have Microsoft 365 subscription. So I will use the Azure AD that comes with Microsoft 365 to demonstrate this. Then I also enrolled to a Dropbox trial, Dropbox business trial, so that I have this single sign-on capability with that Dropbox trial account. So let's see how to do this. So first you have to enroll to a Dropbox trial account, or if you already have a business account, that is fine. Click on the Dropbox free trial. So enter your business address, agree with the license terms, and click to start the free trial. Now you have to verify your email address. So go and check your account, then complete the verification. Now the account get verified. Let me put a team account name. So we're done with the minimum configurations that required in this Dropbox trial. Now from this admin console, you will see what are the controls you have with this Dropbox business trial. You can see a members area where you can add members. Then you have settings where you can see two-step verification. Then below that you will see a single sign-on option. Click on the single sign-on. That will show you the configuration page where you can configure this SAML authentication. So off, you have two options. You can make it optional, or you can make it required. So once you have required, which means only you can access through a single sign-on, there is no other way to access your account. Then you have identity provider, sign-in URL, then certificate, then single sign-in URL things. So we have to move to the Azure side, browse portal.azure.com. So once you complete this login, then once you complete the login, search for enterprise application, where you will find a lot of gallery applications which Microsoft already pre-configured. So this pre-configured application will make your life easier when you want to configure single sign-on. So here you will find Dropbox and many other applications are also there. If you don't have your application in this list, still you can configure. You can create your own application for SAML configuration. Now you can see that the SAML based single sign-on is supported in this pre-configured Dropbox business gallery application. So you can simply modify the name, then click to create. So now you have Dropbox business exam portal, that is from the Azure AD gallery, and you can see in the from the getting started, the first step is to assign users. Then you can set up single sign-on. So let's add some users to this gallery application. So I have a few users in this trial account. So just add, then click on the assign button. Now go back to the overview and see what is the next step. Next step is to set up a single sign-on. So SAML is our choice. So click on the SAML. So now it is time to do the basic configuration. So basic configuration, you can see this is the entity ID that you have to give here. So it can be the URL or a Dropbox. I will give the URL name now, and that will fail when we try this configuration, but I just want to demonstrate to you also how to troubleshoot. So we will give the URL instead of the Dropbox identity. So the reply URL and the sign-on URL, you have to provide it. So I will just keep this URL. That is not the correct one. We have to put Dropbox instead of that. Just to show you troubleshooting, let it go. Then you have to provide the reply URL. So this URL is what, then you have to provide a reply URL. So once the user get authenticated from Azure AD, the response will send back to the Dropbox, and the user will be navigated to this SAML underscore login URL. Then you have to provide the sign on URL. You can see that the sign in URL, you can copy the link simply, then you can add it here. The other informations are not mandatory, so if you want you can provide, otherwise you can skip it. So we're done with the basic SAML configuration. Now the second step is user attributes and claim. So you saw when in the response SML file that include the username, then a surname, email address. If you don't want to provide some of the claims, then you can remove it. If you want to add new values here, you can add also. So you have a control of what kind of information that you are providing to the service provider. Then the third step is the SAML sign-in certificate. So you have to download the certificate here. Then this have to be provided to the Dropbox, so Dropbox can verify the SAML response, because when identity provider Azure AD send a response, it's signed by identity provider. So as the Dropbox have the certificate which can verify the authenticity of a SAML response. So download the certificate, the base 64, then upload this to the Dropbox. So click on the upload, then open, then save it. Now the SSO certificate has uploaded successfully. Now go back to the Azure and see what are the other configurations that we need to complete. Now you can see the fifth option, that is the configuration URL, that is login URL and logout URL and Azure AD identifier. So let's copy this value and give it to Dropbox. So the sign in URL. So Dropbox will redirect the user browser to this URL whenever the user try to log in. Then logout URL. So logout URL is added because once you sign out from the Dropbox, this URL is used so that the user will be signed out from the Azure AD also. Otherwise the user will stay signed in even you're not using Dropbox. Now we're done with the fifth step also. The next step is to test the single sign-on. So before that, you can see in the fourth step there is an option you have to install Azure AD browser extension, and once you install this extension, then you will be able to test it from the same window instead of using another window and log in with a different user. So complete this installation. I already installed this extension with other browser, so I will show you. So you can complete this installation. Once you complete the installation, we can go for a test with a test user. So after you install this browser extension, then you can click on the test button. Then you can see there is a option to test by the current user or sign in as someone else. So let us try to sign in as the current user and try to test our connectivity between these. And you can see that there is an error that is something related to entity ID mismatch. So what I have given here is a URL. Typically URL is what provided in the entity ID. But between the Dropbox and Azure AD, you have to provide a Dropbox actually. So the solution is simply click on the fix it. You can see here the entity ID I provided is a dropbox.com. It's supposed to be a Dropbox. So you can simply click on the fix it, that will fix this error. Then once you fixed your error, then you can again test the sign in as someone else or sign in as the current user. So this time I will try to sign in as someone else, and I will try to use one of the username that we added to Azure AD Gallery application user provisioning. So entering the password, and you can see that the sign in is successful. Where you can see the name, ID, the token claim, what are the details included in the token claim, and the token sign-in certificate. So our configuration is correct. We are able to sign in with the single sign-on. You can download this SAML response and SAML request, so that will be helpful for you if you want to see exactly what the authentication request and response looks like. So now we have a single sign-on. Now it is time to go to the provision user account. You have an option to automatically provision the user, so that you don't need to involve all the time to provide the Dropbox access. You can create a user group or something, and the people who are in that user group can be automatically provided access to Dropbox. So you have two options. You can provision this manually, or you can provision it automatically. So let's click on the automatic option. So the first thing, you have to authorize this. For that you need to enter the Dropbox administrator credential. So let's do that first. Then click on the sign in button. So that will prompt to authorize this connectivity. And once you authorize, then Azure can do a lot of automation when it comes to the user provisioning. You can test the connectivity here. Now the authorization is successful. So you have an option to use the groups or directories. I will keep it default. Now the provisioning status is on. Then click on the save button. Then go back to the enterprise application. Then from the provisioning, you can see that you have an option to start and stop provisioning, and you from the logs you can see that the successful provisioning, where you can see that the two users we added has successfully provisioned. The other option is from the Dropbox admin console. You can invite with an email address. So I send an invitation to one of the user, comes under my M365 tenant, and that invite reaches to the user mailbox. From there he can join to this, from there he can accept this invitation. Now you can see that the join your team email is there. So the only thing he need to enter is the first name and last surname. Then click on the I agree button, then create the account. So that will create an account in Dropbox. You can see that it didn't ask for any passwords because it is a single sign-on SAML configured. So later onwards, the user is going to log in with Azure AD. Identity provider will provide the user authentication, and Dropbox, the service provider, will provide the access to this user. You can install this SAML Tracer to your browser. Then you can see the response and the authentication request that's sent by the service provider and identity provider. And also the IDP will respond back to the Dropbox. As it all happened through the user browser, it will be easy for you to have a look at this response and authentication request from the SAML Tracer. So now the SAML Tracer is ready. So what I'm going to do is I will try to access Dropbox. Now click on the sign in button and enter one of the user name. So I only need to enter the username. Once I complete my username, you can see that the Dropbox automatically enable the single sign-on, and it take me to the Azure AD login page where I have to enter my username and password. And on the right side, you can see that there is a SAML icon on some of the link. This is what the SAML authentication request. You simply need to click yes, and you will find another SAML response from IDP. So this is how the SAML response and SAML authentication request you can see from this from the SAML Tracer. We already explained this SAML authentication, the content inside the SAML authentication, and also the content inside the SAML response. Anyway, once you click on this SAML link, you will find HTTP parameters, SAML, and summary. Once you click on the SAML, you will see that the authentication request details over assertion consumer service URL, then the issuer identity name. So all this what we explained you can see from here. Then if you click on the post SAML response, where you will find the response, you can see that the response, you can see the SAML response here. Now the destination is Dropbox. So whatever the attributes that we found when we explained in the slides are here. You can see the signature, the certificate, and also in the bottom you will see the claims that provided by identity provider to the Dropbox, include the username, email address, display name, given name, and all this informations. So that is all. Thank you for watching this video, and for more videos, subscribe my YouTube channel.